I am 18, 20 months into my role at Landcorp, and what I've discovered is I sort of am about down where the politicians sit in terms of popularity. I'm an Aucklander, born and bred. I work for a corporate farmer and the CEO of Landcorp, and that is basically the trifecta for animosity within the rural sector. So I've sort of acknowledged that already at the outset. I wanted to just really spend a bit of time talking about Landcorp's view on the dairy industry. As I mentioned, I grew up in Auckland. I'm not a dairy farmer. In fact, I've only come to the ag sector relatively recently. You guys collectively know way more than I do about the dairy industry. So what I've done today is just tried to approach this whole industry with a fresh set of eyes as someone who's come into the industry recently. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about 3 observations I've got of the dairy industry up until this point. Now, I was going to launch straight into that part of the presentation, but I actually just wanted to stop and talk about something else for a minute or two. And that's, I want to talk to you about a woman called Kay. Kay worked on one of our dairy farms down on the west coast in the South Island. She was a dairy assistant. And she was in her early to mid-50s, came to dairy farming quite late. So she'd only been with us for about 6 months, her first farming job. And she loved this new career of hers. It was her second career, effectively. Loved what she was doing. Had taken a particular love and enjoyment dealing with animals, and had become quite involved in terms of her own personal interest in a planting program across the farm. And about a month ago, she'd done milking in the morning. She had been hosing down the dairy shed, the milking shed, the dairy shed. Suddenly pressure went, and there was an expectation that there must be a fault with the water line somewhere on the farm. So she took off on one of our quads and didn't come back. She rolled the quad bike and is a fatality. Now, Landcorp spends a huge amount of money, time and energy on safety. We buy really good equipment for our staff. We spend an awful lot of time training them, and we have done a lot to try to raise awareness of safety. And yet we've had a fatality on one of our farms. In fact, this is the second fatality we've had over a 5-year period within Landcorp. And it would be really good to say that Kay's experience was an exception. But as I think you guys know better than most, farming has got a pretty horrific safety track record. 104 fatalities in the last 5 years, since 2010, which makes us worse than construction, mining and forestry combined. 220,000 days lost with people off, injured. We're regarded by WorkSafe as a high-risk industry. And I have a lot of people coming to me talking about why they will not have their son or daughter go into farming. And the core reason is not pay, it's not opportunity, it's not the long hours, it's because they don't feel as though their son and daughter will be safe if they come into the farming career, to the farming sector. Now, I know a lot of you would be sitting there thinking, well, you know, farming's a dangerous industry. It's always been that way. It's a high-risk industry. It's always the way it's been, and unfortunately, it's always the way it will be. And I don't think we can afford to take that attitude any longer. And we're going to spend an awful lot of time over the next 3 days talking about the future of the dairy industry, and I think there'll be a lot of positive stuff here to get excited about. But if we continue to kill 20+ people per year on our farms across the country, we're not going to attract young people to come and work in our farming sector. And I'd argue the future of our industry, no matter how good whatever happens behind the farm gate or in front of the farm gate is less than secure. So that's an observation I wanted to make at the outset. Safety is very much front of mind for us as an organisation at the present point in time, particularly in light of Kay's death about a month ago. Landcorp is a very large deer farmer. Got about 105,000 deer. I think that makes us around about 15% of the country's deer herd. So it's a really important product species for us. And we've been farming deer for many, many years. And generally speaking, despite the fact that I get a lot of people coming to me saying, well, if we converted more of our properties to dairy, we could be making more money. Landcorp's really committed to the dairy industry and committed to having a diversified collection of farms with a diversified species group across those farms. And I'm really encouraged by a lot of work that DINS is doing to try and link the market with what we're doing on farm to make sense going forward. But I think there are largely three things that we need to do as an organisation, as an industry, going forward to be successful and to be sustainable. Now, as I mentioned to you guys, I'm not a farmer. In fact, I spent many years actually living in and working in New York for a management consulting company. So what they did, or what we used to do back then, was get on a plane on Monday morning and would travel to a client somewhere else in the world or in the country, and would spend 4 days or 5 days working with that client on problems that they had, but principally on strategies to help them grow their profitability. And then would get on a plane on Thursday night and fly back to New York. I know for many of you that sounds like a horrible way to spend your life, but it was what I did for 5 years. And so I worked in the finance sector and telecommunications and media and Coca-Cola and a whole range of different companies. And we used to charge an awful lot of money to give these companies advice. But really, whatever we advised typically boiled down to two key things that any successful business and any successful industry had to do. The first thing it had to do was it had to have a product or service that was in high demand that customers wanted. Pretty obvious, right? And I think in venison and velvet and deer generally, we have that. The second thing that you had to have, though, was high barriers to entry. What that means is it was no good having a really attractive product if anyone could come along and make that product or provide that service, because the price of that product would quickly diminish. And I think when you look at venison and when you look at the deer sector, we're incredibly uniquely positioned because we've got a high quality product, which I'm going to talk about in a second, that customers like and will love increasingly as we educate the market about it. And we have really high barriers to entry. I mean, as you guys know, only about half of the intensively farmed deer is farmed outside of New Zealand. So New Zealand's the leading deer farming country in the world. It's hard to get into deer farming. There's a whole lot of infrastructure you need to build. There's a whole lot of management systems you need to develop. There are genetics you need to understand, and you need to fundamentally learn how to farm what is a highly volatile animal. So New Zealand has an opportunity here with the deer sector to do something quite unique. And I think, even though we're only 45 years old as an industry, and I know you've seen a lot of the programs come and go, particularly those of you who've been in the industry for a long time, I'm really convinced when I look at it as an outsider looking in, and as someone who's looked at lots of industries, that the fundamentals for this industry are actually really, really strong. But we're only going to be able to capture them if we do three things, I think, really, really well. And the first thing I think we need to do is to actually showcase deer's unique properties. And I was really interested listening to Dan and Andy talk and those comparisons between deer, beef and lamb. And I think my first observation would be that we haven't been particularly good as an industry at really showcasing just how unique deer is as a species and how unique the products are that deer actually produce. And as I think back to, the guys who actually started this industry 45 or 50 years ago, I think back to the huge risks they took to take what was a wild game animal, considered a pest in New Zealand, convince MAF that it should actually have accreditation as a farming animal, convince a skeptical consumer base that farmed deer was worth consuming and eating, and then develop all the techniques they needed to develop over time around how you farm those deer profitably. And incredibly, after only 10 years, and I didn't realise this until I was preparing for this talk, 10 years after the first licence to farm was issued to Rahana Station near Taupo in 1970, there were 800 deer farmers. 1,500,000 deer existed. So it was an industry that grew incredibly quickly. And I was hearing people behind me during Dan and Andy's talk talking about how deer farming was incredibly profitable in the 1980s. And I think what's happened is there's been this extraordinary pioneering spirit amongst the deer sector here to create, probably against all odds, an industry that should otherwise not really exist. But I think we can only maintain that momentum as a sector if we can really continue to embrace that pioneering spirit and continue to innovate. And I think a key part of it is really understanding and appreciating and trying to get value out of what makes deer farming so unique in terms of its properties. So one thing that we're trying to do as an organisation is start to work with other organisations that appreciate and can sell really effectively the deer products, both venison and the co-products, as a really exclusive high-end product to discerning and niche customers around the world. We're working with light leathers at the present point in time to try and take particular deer hides from some of our farms around the country and have them directly targeted at particular high-end fashion houses around the world. And the exciting thing for me is that these products, when they're exposed to the likes of the leather buyers at Gucci and Prada and Hugo Boss and the other big fashion houses around the world, the very most exclusive brands that exist in the world today that are worth billions and billions of dollars, those buyers love what deer stands for. They love the characteristics of its qualities, and they love the stories that can be told around deer coming out of this pristine country called New Zealand. The scary thing about it, of course, is that, a hide, and basically 2 hides are used to make one of the exclusive high-end leather satchels that some of the customers are making. We get paid as deer farmers probably about 1% of the retail value of those products. But that gives me a huge amount of confidence to know that if we can create more value, there is a lot of value to be shared after the consumer's paid $2,000 to $2,500 for a particular garment that we as contributors in that value chain can be a part of going forward. We're also starting to think a little bit expansively about what other products we can produce off those species of animals that we farm across the country. And some in recent times have just actually set up a joint venture with another group to create a sheep milking venture. And sheep milk has some pretty extraordinary characteristics as a product. Highly, highly nutritious. A niche product that high-end consumers are prepared to pay a lot of money for. Again, largely only produced in New Zealand because, as we know, we're the largest exporter of sheep products around the world, and potentially off a much smaller environmental footprint than bovine dairy. So we've started to explore what sheep dairy could look like. And we've also started to work with New Zealand Dairy Products on exploring the possibility of producing deer milk for the exact same reasons why sheep milk to us is particularly attractive. We're working on an R&D program with them at the present point in time to see both what market demand looks like for deer milk as a new potential product, what the nutritional characteristics of deer milk are, and probably the hardest part of all, how do you go about extracting deer milk without getting kicked in the head in a sustainable way, which is not easy. But the thing that's really blown me away as I've prepared this talk is to just understand a bit more about what a special product deer is from a nutritional point of view. And here are some high-level stats just on deer milk in terms of its characteristics. We thought sheep milk looked pretty incredible as a product, but it's got nothing to do with deer milk. No comparison, at least, to deer milk. And the thing I like about it as a person who's helped a lot of companies around the world is there's a really unique story we can tell here, and there are incredibly high barriers to entry. If we can figure out how to produce deer milk and sell it effectively, it's going to be virtually impossible for anyone else around the world to try and replicate what we've done, and it immediately becomes a unique thing that New Zealand can produce on its own around the world. So that sort of thing excites me in terms of its potential. An awful way off in terms of being able to get this to market, but we're really keen to work with people who want to innovate around deer, and particularly those who want to start to attract and target key customers. The other thing that's really important and apparent to me is that health and nutrition is ranked and valued really highly by the consumers. Sure, it's got to taste good and it's got to be value for money, but health and nutrition is increasingly growing in importance going forward as an attribute for consumers. And as I've just referenced a couple of times, I had no idea before I looked into this at what a great product venison is compared to beef and lamb, and compared to chicken, and compared to salmon. Really high in protein, low calories, low saturated fats, really high in iron, and pretty good in terms of cholesterol. It's an extraordinary product. And yet my observation has been is that as an industry, we haven't probably told that story and really marketed as effectively as we could just how unique venison is as a particular product going forward. And the other piece to this, of course, which we'll talk about a lot, is the good environmental story that deer farming can tell on the world stage, and the opportunity for the deer industry to showcase high-end sustainable farming practices as a way of differentiating from other protein products. But it's one thing to have a really fantastic core product, which we seem to have with deer. It's quite another thing for consumers who buy it and the customers who sell it to really make the most of it and understand that. And I just want to sort of take you through my observation when I've looked at how well we've done at telling the story around deer and its unique nutritional characteristics. I typed in superfoods into Google and went through a whole lot of different sites which talked about superfoods for athletes, superfoods for American football, superfoods in the Daily Mail. The Scotsman talked about Scottish superfoods. I had no idea that venison appeared on just about every superfoods list that existed that I could find online. It's a remarkable product, as we've already seen, for its nutritional characteristics. And according to the Scotsman, better still, it has full of flavour and it's easy to cook. Books featuring venison in terms of its superfood characteristics. So I thought, well, you know, how good are we at being at telling the story around venison as a superfood if all the blogs around the world, and the nutritional blogs, seem to be talking a lot about the nutritional characteristics and benefits of venison. So I typed in venison.co.nz, thinking this would be a site, if anywhere, that's going to talk about it, so it was directed to the Silver Ferns site. Spent a fair bit of time looking around the Silver Ferns site to see if I could find any information about nutrition, and couldn't. And then I got to this page where I wanted to learn about what products I could get if I was interested in venison, and found a really lovely packaging of venison steaks, but also a lamb steaks package. And then if you scroll through a bit further, you get to the beefsteak packages on the venison.com website. And it's not surprising, because Silver Fern Farms is selling beef, lamb, and venison. So it's not surprising they'd be wanting to sell them collectively. But I wasn't particularly educated or informed about this great superfood called venison by going to Silver Fern Farms' website. Would I have any more luck if I went to Alliance? They had a link called Nutrition, which was good, on the left over here. But when you go into nutrition, it talks a lot about the benefits of red meat in general, rather than venison. And then if you wanted to learn more, you'd go down to that link down there, and that would take you through to beef and lamb. And I was pretty sure I wouldn't find a great deal of information on venison at beef and lamb. So I guess the point being, for our two largest meat processors, venison is one of a number of products they sell. And it's not in their interest particularly to try and showcase venison at the expense of beef and of lamb. But the reality is that if you're a consumer and you're looking to get some red meat or to get some white meat, you're going in and looking at red meat, and you're choosing between beef, you're choosing between lamb, and you're choosing between venison. So if we don't have guys who are out there showcasing venison, how can we promote it as a superfood if it's being lumped in with red meat in general terms? I went to Mountain River, I went to Duncan & Co, and I went to First Light Foods, and it's fair to say I didn't quite get the nutritional information out of any of those guys either. So I'm not just picking on the big guys. I did get from the DIN's NZ Venison website a healthy living expose on venison, which is fantastic. So at least it is being showcased by the industry, which is really good. So I thought, well, maybe we're not alone in this. Maybe none of the companies who sell primary produce or sell protein or food are particularly good at talking about the nutritional characteristics of what they did. What are the chicken guys up to? Well, I went to Tegel, and of course they had nutrition up the top and talked about the benefits of lean and light and why chicken is such a great food. New Zealand King Salmon had a section all about nutrition, as you'd expect in terms of how good salmon is with its omega-3s. Fonterra, you can see one of its main links is all about nutrition, and they have a panel of experts who talk about the research they're doing into the nutritional benefits of dairy, plus a whole lot of articles on dairy nutrition. And Zespri, probably one of the most successful New Zealand primary producing success stories around the world at the present point in time. Up in lights at the top, nutrition and delicious, and a pyramid showcasing how good kiwi fruit is relative to other fruits and vegetables. Shamelessly promoting kiwi fruit at the expense of other fruit and vegetables in terms of nutritional characteristics. So that sort of led me to believe and maybe you don't agree with me here, but as an outsider looking at this, venison looks like an amazing product. There seems to be this real trend towards trying to find these superfoods which have these amazing nutritional characteristics. Venison seems to get promoted really heavily by people who are in the nutrition space as a great food. But we've done a really lousy job as an industry at marketing and talking about how good venison is from a nutritional point of view. That's an observation I have. Now we can talk a bit about innovation around packaging. Because we're just trying to win people's attention and their hearts and mind. And I think, if anything, in the dairy industry, we have to be more innovative than anyone else because we're a small industry. And while we've got an amazing product, we've got very small budgets. And so everything we need to do as an industry has to be innovative. And it looks as though, meat packaging has probably changed about 0% over the last 30 years. But it's fair to say that Silver Fern Farms, I think, is actually starting to raise the game to put some attractive looking packaging which informs the consumer about the meat they're buying and actually makes it feel as though it's a high value product in the market. But I think, we seem to be light years behind still. Other meat companies around the world have started to get really creative in their thinking about how they can just package a product, which is an amazing product in its first instance, and then should be presented as an amazing product when it hits the consumer in the supermarket shelves. There's just really cool ways of creatively thinking about how we can actually market and promote through our packaging the uniqueness of the products that we have. So that's a big opportunity, I think, for more innovation from the dairy sector. Then there's this incredible thing about the other nutritional products that can come from venison. Venison jerky's been around for a long period of time. But there's this amazing trend that you guys will have heard about towards protein and the love of animal protein. And whether you're on a paleo diet or you're on a high protein diet or whatever it is, there's a $19 billion industry out there which is all about how you access protein products as snack foods. And I would have thought, given venison is a superfood, amazing nutritional products, where's the opportunity for us to start innovating in this space, given New Zealand owns venison as a product? Where is the innovation that we're driving around new products targeted at this $19 billion snack food market, which can get produced in New Zealand, can get shipped around the world, is not chilled or frozen, so it doesn't have the supply chain issues that we've been debating during the last Q&A session, and that fundamentally we can extract a huge value from and tell a really compelling nutritional story. I mean, it's just a question, I don't know. But to me, it would feel like a huge opportunity for the venison industry to innovate. And after snacks, you then get into protein powders and the big growth in all these formula products, NutriShakes and the like, which are based on animal proteins, which is a huge opportunity. Another opportunity is to start to think about how we can actually put venison next to the utensils we're eating it with and what that can actually do to drive some different experiences. There's a firm called AromaFork, which have basically developed these forks, and you put a drop of that scented liquid on the fork, and your sense of smell is a lot more sophisticated than your taste buds. And what they've found is that if you consume food using that fork with these little sensory buds at the time, you have a completely different sensory experience when it comes to the flavour of that food than you would otherwise have if you just had that food by itself. And that's a combination of all the different sorts of smells and flavours you can put around venison. So I suppose the question mark is, why can't we be out there actually selling our products with some of these innovations that is going to completely revolutionise people's view of venison as a product and meat as a food category and experience. I think there's some unbelievable developments taking place around food that, as a small niche industry, we might have the opportunity to really establish ourselves and make a difference. Then there's this whole linkage between fashion and food. And all the big fashion houses, for reasons that escape me, have decided that they actually need to start expanding into the food category. And the experience that they want their shoppers to have as they spend thousands of dollars on clothing or fashion accessories is to also link it with high-end food and eating. And then at the same time link high-end food and eating with also restaurants and hotels and the like. Now, we talked a bit about the relationship we have with New Zealand Light Leathers to produce high-end fashion accessories off deer hide. There's an opportunity for us at the same time to link that deer hide with high-end, those same high-end consumers eating high-end venison, attractively packaged. It strikes me as an opportunity to again be niche, targeted and high-end. And I think to try and capture all this, Landcorp started to think about how it can actually tell its story around what it does with venison in a compelling way that's going to connect with these customers around the world, who, as you all know, are increasingly interested in where their food comes from, or where their hides come from, the farming that went into it, and confidence that the food is both safe, secure, and the people, environment, and animals have been appropriately treated in the production of that product, which is why we've started to move away from Landcorp and started to talk a bit more about palming. So I think there's great opportunity for us to innovate around this amazing product that we all are responsible for farming in deer. I think we've done a pretty average job so far at communicating just how extraordinary venison is. And there are some amazing consumer trends occurring at the present point in time, which I think are great opportunities for the deer sector, particularly around venison. And then the third piece is, we've started to really think within Landcorp about what do we need to change in terms of the way we're farming to make sure we're not only linked to the market, which is all about the Pamu brand, but also that we're driving productivity as much as we can to be as sustainable as we can. And a big part of that is technology, and it's not so much technology, it's as much as anything as data. And I suppose, Landcorp, like all you guys, would be collecting lots of data about what it does, but all that data is based largely on averages. And I think as a farming sector, we're moving away from farming by average to farming by individual animal. And we feel as though we need good data to allow us to do that effectively. So we use this Farm IQ tool called FMS. It's relatively easy to track what we're doing from a land perspective. It's going to be increasingly important for us to be able to track and show what we're doing from an environmental perspective in terms of our nutrient footprint and our water usage. But we really feel that the biggest opportunities sit in the ability for us to actually start to farm and manage animals as individuals rather than as averages. And that's where we're spending a lot of time at present trying to figure out how we can take all this data that we're capturing about individual animal performance and use that to start to drive more targeted animal interventions on farm. We're about to move into a new world with Nate in terms of our ability and requirement to track what's happening with animals, to ensure that that animal information is being included as part of the national database, and to link animals with the financial systems that you drive so that you can understand exactly what's happening on your balance sheet. We need to have really good tools to allow us to do that. And as I talked about, we really want to get away from treating animals as a herd and start to really understand what's happening across each of the animals in our herd so that we can start to apply some very specific interventions on those animals to drive performance. Whenever I look at our performance, whether it's heifer raising, the performance of our deer at various stages, milk production, whatever it is, I'm staggered that from the same genetics and the same paddock with the same food, the huge variance in performance that exists across animals. I'm not a farmer, so to me that was just completely counterintuitive when I came across that. But it also told me that there's a huge opportunity here in just pure productivity gain by making sure we are focusing on the guys very much on the left and in the middle and making sure we're pushing them as quickly as we can to the right or exiting them from the herd as fast as possible so that we can continue to drive that productivity gain going forward. We need to be able to track it by year, and then it's really important for us that we start to get information back from the processor on their kill sheets in terms of how our products have actually done, which is why I think the whole Beef EQ program I think is quite exciting because it's now starting to get direct information feeding back on a real-time basis almost in terms of what's happened at the processor in terms of the animals that have been submitted and what does that mean in terms of our farming practices on farm as a result. So I think there's a really big shift towards a more analytical approach towards farming. We're miles off from being able to do it effectively. I'd say intuition and years of experience are going to be much more important in terms of making good decision making for a while to come. But if you look at every other industry around the world, it's taken this thing called big data, and it's starting to manipulate and analyze big data, which is driving completely new ways of doing business, and I suspect that'll happen in farming. And Landcorp just wants to make sure it's sort of helping lead the way in a constructive sense going forward in order for us to do that. Well, that's all I wanted to cover off today in my talk. I've shaved a few minutes off your time. In general terms, what I wanted to do basically was just to try and show that Landcorp's trying to think quite expansively about the future of the deer sector. We're really supportive of what Dan and Andy are doing. The Passion to Profit program I think is fantastic. Savannah's a great concept. But as Dan explained, there are just some fundamental limitations, both in terms of the supply curve and the demand curve, which is always going to make chilled and frozen venison as a product hard to extract a whole lot more value from, which is why we really want to work with other industry participants to see what else we can do with this incredible animal called deer to drive a really sustainable long-term future, to the point where I'm under pressure within Landcorp to stop converting dairy farms into deer farms. That's my goal and aspiration. Thanks very much for your time, everyone.
So Steve, you did conveniently run yourself out of time there for questions, but we're going to change the rules and add another 5 minutes in. So who's got some questions for Steve on that? There's one over the back, Donald.
Dan, I'm a bit like Steve. It's probably more an observation, but I noted in your address before that you were no longer talking about processors, you were talking about marketers, the 5 marketers you were telling us. And yet, Steve sort of raised some points there that they may still be closer to processors than marketers, in that some of the opportunities he's outlined, they aren't going there yet.
That's an observation, Donald.
Look, it's really easy to be critical of the marketers and processors. They've just got really difficult business models, and they're actually trying a whole lot of really innovative stuff, and it's, we're supportive of all that. But when I just look at it from just a purely venison perspective, it just seems like there's a big opportunity there that we haven't quite captured yet, which just actually gives me a huge amount of encouragement more than anything else.
Another one?
Excellent.
Oh, here we go, David.
When you looked at on the website, you looked at the nutritional value, do you follow some of that too perhaps into the overseas markets and where they can provide that information there? That's something on the website is good for maybe pay over consumers here, or whatever overseas with that information get those overseas markets,
For the chicken and the salmon.
For the venison.
There's quite a lot of nutritional information about venison based on American websites offshore, so we're not providing that information particularly. I guess, being the internet, anyone can access a New Zealand website, so if people are keen on venison, they'll probably come to the New Zealand venison website, which has some of that nutritional information. But given how good a story it is, I think the paucity of information is pretty extraordinary in my view.
Steve, interesting just to hear your thoughts on deer and the point of view. I'd like to see you actually be on within boards and that, but one thing I'd like to see you not do is with Landcorp, is to keep converting. You were heavily into deer and then you went into dairy. It'd be nice just to see you keep the status quo. So we're not having these big fluctuations.
Yep.
At a time when our industry is quite killing.
Well, you've made that comment at a very good time with the milk price looking sub 5 for next year, which gets a bit painful. the big velvet missed opportunity. We're overexposed to dairy, and what it does is it makes us as an organisation too volatile in terms of our earnings. So I'd love for us to be able to continue to expand our red meat business, and that's an aspiration that we have. The other thing is, as farmers, we can't really differentiate ourselves in milk. We're just a milk producer, and our milk goes into the vat like everyone else's. I think with red meat, in particular with venison, as we've talked about, there's an amazing, unique story here that as New Zealand's largest deer farmer and as a country, as the largest deer producing country in the world, we can really capture. And I think that's where Landcorp can help the industry in general terms, you know, working with the industry bodies to help move the industry forward.
One more, anyone?
Yeah, just down here.
Yep.
Are you hoping to, talk about your own branding, are you hoping to put that with, obviously on the other marketers' packaging as you send your Landcorp product around the world?
Yeah, those are discussions we're currently having at the moment. And I mean, the key thing from my perspective is we have to add value to the process of the business beyond just providing lots of animals. And part of that is crafting a story that they can then tell to their consumers in an effective way. It's sort of a little bit sad to me that Silver Fern Farms has produced this range called Homaka Hills. I tried to look up and find out where Homaka Hills was, and it doesn't exist, you know. So why are we having to make up hypothetical farming names when we've got lots of great farms that tell amazing stories, whether they're Pāmu farms or non-Pāmu farms? And I think we have to help the marketers somehow convert what we do on farm and package that in a way that's really compelling to the consumer, because I just feel as though the consumers are missing out at the moment on a huge part of the coolness that is the venison experience. So if we can do that through Pāmu with them or working in conjunction with Savannah, that's fantastic. But it's early days for us at this point, and we've got a long way to go before we can say a great deal more about it. Thanks very much, everyone.
Steve, I think you can see the audience can see the sort of leadership you're bringing, the change of thinking that an outsider comes after coming in from another sector and coming back to New Zealand brings to Landcorp. If you were listening very carefully, which I'm sure you were, to Steve, you heard him talk about products in demand and a high barrier to entry. And one of the key things about deer farming, if it was easy, there'd be a lot more people doing it. The things that challenge us, that make it difficult, are the reason that we can create some value. I think Steve's identified that. What we welcome as an industry is Landcorp's higher level of engagement. We have Steve here, we have Graham here, we also have perhaps Sarah. I don't know that people know that you're here. Perhaps you'd like to stand up. Sarah is Landcorp's marketing manager. She comes from Fonterra. She's got a background in international marketing, and she's another person that's adding some value. Landcorp are our largest deer farmer, and we welcome their involvement in the industry. So thank you, Steve, and just a small token of appreciation.